Okay, hi everybody. Why don't we get started? I am very pleased to be introducing this week's speaker. Not only is he somebody whose work I very much admire, but also, as we'll find out today, he's coming to speak to us about very timely topics. So, Professor Jack Glaser is a professor and associate dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. And by the way, if any of you are interested in public policy for graduate school, you'd be hard-pressed to do better than the Goldman School. So we're very pleased to have him here. Professor Glaser's PhD and expertise is in social psychology, and his research is focused on stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, examining everything from unconscious thoughts, prejudice and discrimination, feelings and motives, to the actual behaviors of profiling, hate crimes, and so on. A large portion of his work has focused on unconscious bias and other forms of stereotyping and racial profiling among law enforcement, which was the topic of his recent book, Suspect Race, which was published last year by Oxford University Press, and you can find in bookstores now.
Probably not, actually.
No, is it already?
Online.
Okay, online, right. And now he's working with the Center for Policing Equity to develop a national justice database of police stops and the use of force incidents. So bias, policing, use of force by police, all topics that are of immediate concern. And today he is speaking on racial bias in policing, psychological causes, and policy implications. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jack Glaser.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And can everybody hear me all right? Okay, nice acoustics. So I'm going to be talking about, as Professor Glasgow mentioned, very topical issues. And I will get to the issue of excessive and racially disparate force by police officers. But I'm going to start by talking about a broader problem that's been a topic of concern for a long time, which is just more generally disparate stops and arrests of African Americans and Latinos. And so let's start by setting the historical context, which is that starting in the 1970s with the advent of the war on drugs, the number of discretionary stops by police increased dramatically, and the number of arrests for drug crimes and weapons possession increased dramatically. And what this graph shows is that over the period, and by the way, these data are actually harder to get than you would think, and so I'm confident in the data from 1980 to 2010, but the 1970s data is a little more spotty. But from 1980 or so to roughly the present, the number of white men incarcerated almost tripled over that period. And the same can be said for the rate of incarceration for African American men, except that the slope was more steep, and the eventual rate of incarceration is much more dramatic, whereas at the present day, roughly 3% of African American men are in jail or prison serving a term. More dramatic than that, we can find an example or an illustration of this disparity in a projection carried out by the Bureau of Justice Statistics in 2003, where they estimated that of men born that year, the proportion who would be incarcerated at some point in their lives for white men was about 6%, but for Hispanics and African Americans it was 17% and 32%. And so this is one of these graphs where, we put up bar graphs so you can make comparisons, right? And clearly African Americans and Hispanics are projected by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, relatively conservative projection as procedures, to be incarcerated at much higher rates than whites. But I could cover up the right bar or the two right bars, and we could just talk about this. And the implications of this is that roughly a third of black men born in 2003 are likely to be incarcerated at some point in their lives, with all the collateral effects that come along with that. And I'm going to talk about those later on, but these are public health effects and economic effects and even voter disenfranchisement effects. We can start to see why this happens by looking at some of the actual data. And I don't know if you're familiar with the New York Police Department's Stop, Question, and Frisk program, but that's something that ramped up dramatically from the late 1990s through around 2009, 2010, when it started to come down. Stop, Question, and Frisk is a program by the Street Crimes Unit of the NYPD. And the intention is to put a lot of pressure on low-level drug offenders, primarily drug offenders, and the rationale was to catch people carrying weapons as well, but I'll show you some data showing that that doesn't appear to be happening. In any event, there came a lot of attention to the Stop and Frisk program, and there were investigations by the Attorney General of the state of New York and the Department of Justice, and New York started collecting very careful data on every discretionary stop, every pedestrian stop that they were carrying out. And so it's a double-edged sword. A lot of people were being hassled by Stop, Question, and Frisk, but we, as analysts, can get a sense of what was going on by looking at those data. And so, for example, we see from 2008, which was sort of the penultimate year, in 2009 it peaked at about 700,000 stops. In 2008 it was closer to 600,000 stops. So 600,000 pedestrians in New York City stopped and questioned by the police. About half of them patted down. And among those stopped, about half of them, 300,000 or so, were African Americans, overwhelmingly young men. And a smaller number Hispanic and a much smaller number white. African Americans make up about 25% of the New York City population. We can also look at what happens once they're stopped, and we see that among those stopped, blacks and Hispanics are more likely to be frisked than whites, and they're more likely to be subjected to physical force than whites. But the rate at which they're arrested, conditional on being stopped, is almost comparable to whites. And that's pretty surprising given that they're frisked at a much higher rate. When we look at, I'm going to come back to that slide, when we look at the rate at which they're arrested among those who are frisked, we actually see that whites who are frisked are more likely to be arrested than blacks and Hispanics. They're also more likely to yield contraband, non-gun weapons, and comparably likely, everybody is at a very low rate of yielding handguns when stopped, or firearms when stopped. Now this is an interesting set of statistics right here, and it's reminiscent of what we see in a lot of data when we look at police stop data, that in fact, across many different municipalities and even some state highway patrol data, we see that, and I'm going to show you some interesting data from U.S. Customs as well, we often see that whites who are stopped and searched are more likely to be arrested. And the inference that I, as a psychologist, a social psychologist who studies stereotyping and prejudice and discrimination, make from that is that the whites who are stopped are having to meet a higher threshold of suspiciousness in order to get stopped. And therefore, because there is some rationality, there is some signal in the noise that police are using to try to detect people who are offending, because of that, they're more likely to actually be arrested. Blacks and Latinos, part of the suspiciousness that is causing them to be stopped is their very racial or ethnic identity. And that is, to at least some extent, misdirecting police away from really truly suspicious behavior. So this is something we'll come back to. I want to go back a little bit just to give you a sense of why those, what we call hit rates, the rates of people who are yielding contraband or being arrested. And by the way, a good number of these arrests are due to outstanding warrants. They're not necessarily due to people being in possession of contraband, or because you can see that the possession rates are quite low. But anyway, going back, you can see why those hit rates are so low, and part of it is the high level of subjectivity of the rationales the police officers are offering. So one of the things these officers, and I apologize, I'm going to try not to just stay. I was accused recently of having a left side bias, and so part of the theme of this is going to be that everybody's biased. So me too. But in any event, here and I can get closer access on this side to the big bar. So one of the things that the police have to fill out in New York for every one of those stops is the reason they had for stopping the individual. And they can't just say, oh, I just felt like it, or it was arbitrary. They have to provide a reason. And the most common one is furtive movements, which you can imagine is a pretty subjective standard. What are furtive movements? And you can start to imagine how a white officer might see the behavior of somebody from another racial or ethnic group as more furtive than somebody from a group they're more familiar or comfortable with. And then we have, casing a victim or location, the ever discriminating other, and additional bases for making stops. this is completely consistent with what we know across the board about policing and about discretionary stops that police make, which is that police have a lot of discretion. They can essentially stop anybody they want, anytime they want, and they will tell you that, especially in traffic situations. They'll say you follow somebody for 30 seconds and you can pull them over. And in fact, the Supreme Court's criteria for a justifiable stop is so low, and the whole notion of reasonable suspicion, which is the justification for a pat down, is so low that officers, barely have to articulate even the most minimal rationale. So in this environment where officers are almost encouraged to make very subjective judgments, and they are allowed to make a lot of stops without a high degree of evidence, you can understand why there are so many stops and why so few of them are productive, and then you can start to imagine why there are these dramatic racial disparities. And I'm going to talk to you about the psychology of racial and ethnic stereotyping and prejudice to try to connect those dots and explain why I think these racial disparities exist in the data. So in addition to the New York, the NYPD data, there are ample demonstrations that racial profiling, policing, or judgments of suspicion that are based on race or ethnicity, or at least in part, are fairly commonplace. There's evidence from historical analyses of specific departments where revelations have shown that supervisors were encouraging there are some even documented written instructions to use race or ethnicity as a basis for who to pull over, who to stop. There is survey data from Gallup indicating that African Americans in particular report being stopped a lot more by the police and report that those stops seem to be unjustified at a much higher rate. And that's fairly subjective on their part, but in combination, when you look across different methodologies, attitudinal surveys, archival analyses, and statistical analyses, we see a consistent pattern of results. And the statistical evidence from data that is generated by police departments themselves, like the California Highway Patrol, the Illinois Department of Transportation, Maryland State Police, and U.S. Customs, also indicates that members of minority groups are more likely to be stopped and searched, and generally speaking, less likely among those stopped and searched to yield evidence of offending. I'm going to spare you the gory details on most of this analysis, but I'm happy to answer questions about it or provide you with published research in this area. But when I first became interested in racial profiling as a topic, it was because I had read an article. So this is actually 1999. I had just finished my doctoral studies where I had learned to study stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, but from a very psychological perspective. And the main focus of my research was on implicit bias, which I'll talk more about. But biases, stereotypes that operate outside of conscious awareness and control, and we now have methods for measuring them that I'll bet a bunch of you have already been exposed to. But I'm going to give you a website where you can do it yourself. So I read an article in 1999 by a constitutional law professor who was arguing against racial profiling. In the mid-1990s, there were a bunch of revelations in New Jersey and Ohio and California that police were profiling, and it started to become an issue that was rising in the public consciousness. And this article by Randall Kennedy, he argued that racial profiling can't be justified constitutionally. It violates due process and equal protections in the Constitution. But he seemed to concede that it was a rational thing for police to do. If there's some group that's responsible for most of the offending, if there's some group that's buying and selling most of the drugs or more likely to be carrying lethal weapons, then why shouldn't the police just focus on that group? And my reaction to that as a social psychologist was, well, how do we know? We don't actually know who's offending more except based on the criminal justice statistics. And if police are using race as a basis for suspicion, they're going to be stopping more people from these groups. So they're going to necessarily mathematically be catching more people from these groups. And the criminal justice statistics are going to be skewed. And I wanted initially to go ahead and study that, and I would just look to see, well, if police are stopping a group that's offending at a particular rate, but they're stopping them disproportionately, what would the how can that be? And I couldn't do that because we didn't know what the actual underlying offending rates were, and we didn't know what the actual police stop rates were. This is, remember, 1999 when there wasn't very much data available. And so I did the next best thing, which was to make up some data, just play pretend. And I generated hundreds of scenarios with just doing mathematical simulations just to see, well, what would happen to incarceration rates if police were targeting one group more than another. And again, I'm just going to kind of cut to the chase on this, but what my simulations showed was, if you imagine this situation where there's a minority group plotted on the blue line there and a majority group plotted on the red line, and they offend at the same rate. If the police stop them randomly, they'll catch equal proportions of them in possession of drugs or weapons or whatever crime we want to be simulating here. And so at the beginning of some time period, the police are stopping them based just purely on objective criteria of suspiciousness. This, if somebody looks suspicious because of their behavior, they're stopping them. But if the police institute a profiling regime where they suddenly start stopping 4 times as many members of the minority group, what you'll see is that, whereas initially, because they're offending at the same rate, they're going to be incarcerated at the same rate, the same proportion of them will be in prison or jail. If the police are stopping them at a greater rate, and this shouldn't be too surprising, over time, they're going to capture more people from the targeted group. They're going to be stopping more of them, so they're going to catch more of them. And they're going to catch fewer people from the other group because we assume that the police are not increasing their enforcement overall, they're just diverting the resources from one group to another. So if they're paying less attention to the majority group, they're going to capture fewer criminals there. And the net effect of that would actually be that they would, in the long run, capture fewer criminals than they would if they were just ignoring race and ethnicity or ignoring group membership. If we make the really cynical assumption that the minority group actually is offending, and this is where the results get a little more surprising. If we make the cynical assumption that the minority group is offending at a higher rate, if they are 4 times as likely to be in possession of something that would get them arrested if they're stopped and searched, what we find actually is that even under those circumstances, where you would start out where there would be incarcerated at a 4-to-1 ratio, they're offending at a 4-to-1 rate, and so they're caught at a 4-to-1 ratio. If the police start using race or group membership as an indicator of who they should be stopping and searching at a 4-to-1 ratio, the effect over time is going to be that they're going to be captured at more like a 7-to-1 ratio. And so even if you have differential offending, if the police use race on top of other bases of suspicion to stop people and search people, they will exaggerate the disproportions in the criminal justice system. So under this circumstance, they will create disparities where they shouldn't exist. And even when we concede that there might be disparities, they will exaggerate those disparities. And you can start to imagine the self-fulfilling nature of this and how this becomes a vicious cycle. Oh, yeah, that is another thing, was that even under these assumptions that are fairly favorable to racial profiling, where you're stipulating that the minority group offends at a higher rate, the long-term effect in terms of actually capturing criminals is very modest. The net gain in criminal incapacitation is very modest, surprisingly modest, clearly not sufficient to justify the increased disparities in criminal justice outcomes that it's creating. And you can imagine how that kind of behavior on the part of police would promote this pattern of data that we're seeing in the real world. Oh, I thought I was going to show that. But yes, okay. All right, so now you might be thinking, well, okay, that was a pretty short lecture, and clearly somebody's going to give an art history lecture now, and this guy's going to leave. Thank God, that was really boring. But no, this is one of my slides, and it's here for a reason. And I'm sure that you recognize this painting. But I'm going to now show, it's obviously upside down. I'm going to invert it and show you the exact same image right side up. How does the Mona Lisa look to you? Something's wrong, right? Why is it that most of you, I assume, didn't notice that her eyes and mouth had been turned upside down when I presented it this way. And this is audience participation, so what do you think? Yes?
Because I think those are focus points on her face, so you just sort of hone in on them, and the whole picture changes except for those 2 points. So you don't really notice what's happening around it, you just notice those 2 points.
But you mean you notice them on this one,
Yeah,
but you don't notice them here?
yeah.
Okay. Why would you suddenly notice them here? They're in both pictures.
It's out of place.
It's out of place. Right. There's a schema that we have in our heads for the Mona Lisa. We know what she looks like. Sorry, I'm being left side biased again. We know what the Mona Lisa looks like. She doesn't look quite like this. But this seemed fine. This seems fine to most people until you restore the schema. We've disrupted the schema here, and people can't process the Mona Lisa as well as they can when the schema is in its proper orientation. Similarly, does anybody see a triangle? Yeah, I'm seeing that. Maybe 2 triangles? Maybe a Star of David. What's the definition of a triangle? 3-sided and 3-cornered, angled, contiguous, right? Present? No. But we all agree there's at least 1 and probably 2 triangles here. And if you look at this, you might even think that it's a little bit lighter over here and a little bit darker over here. But it's not. And if you kind of position your hand just the right way, you can start to dissipate that illusion. So why would we see triangles when technically there are no triangles?
It's a close enough approximation that our brain just goes to the most recognizable shape we can find.
Yeah, great. It's a close approximation. It's actually not technically a close approximation because we have no contiguous sides here, but there's a clear representation of a triangle here. And yet there isn't technically a triangle or 2 triangles here, but our brain fills in the gap. Just like our brain fills in the gap of the blind spot that occurs because we have a cluster of nerves at the back of our retina, and our brain is constantly filling that in because our brain is constantly being our mind, our consciousness and our unconsciousness is constantly bombarded with incomplete information. We're rarely presented with the exact shape that we need to make an inference about. We get partial information, and it's ambiguous, and we make our best guess as to what it is or what it's supposed to be. If we couldn't do that, we'd be paralyzed. We wouldn't be able to do anything. This is very adaptive, and it's completely normal human cognition. So this leads to the larger subject of schematic cognition, that we process information schematically, and I'm now changing course to talk about the psychological foundations of what causes police officers to see crime when they see people of different skin colors and differentially. So we process information schematically. We perceive objects, we encode information about them, we store that information, and we retrieve it from our memory schematically. And we retrieve it schematically in the sense that if you see something, or if you hear or smell, or something enters your sensory input that is just even remotely related to another concept, that other concept becomes spontaneously activated in your memory. And I'm going to show you the research that shows how that happens. Well, just as we see triangles when they're not there, but we make a reasonable inference that there is one there, we see people schematically as well. Our social cognition is also schematic. So when we see somebody, we spontaneously put them into multiple categories: gender, race, age. And once we've done that, we think about them and we make predictions about how they're thinking and how they're motivated and how they're going to behave based on prior schemas that we have about how people who look like that behave. Those are stereotypes. Stereotypes are these schema-driven perceptions that lead to schema-driven predictions about other people as a function of the groups that they belong to, the gender, the racial, the ethnic, and various other kinds of groups they belong to. This is normal. It's not only normal, it's adaptive. Again, just as you don't need to see a perfectly contiguous, 3-sided, 3-cornered figure to know there's a triangle there, you don't need to have every bit of of information about another person to make a prediction, a reasonable prediction about how they're going to behave. So stereotypes are just these beliefs that we have about the traits that are disproportionately possessed by members of particular groups. And that, too, is normal cognition. Again, we would be paralyzed if we had to treat every other individual as a perfect individual. I know that sounds like a beautiful utopian ideal, that you could treat every other person as a unique individual, but we would really not be able to function if we couldn't make some guesses about how others were going to behave. And to be a little bit glib about it, you make predictions about how people are going to behave if they're dressed in a police officer's uniform. You make predictions about how people are going to behave if they're dressed in a doctor's uniform. But you also, or I don't know if they call them uniforms, but whatever doctors wear, you make predictions about how people are going to behave based on their gender and their age and other things. And that's normal, and it's adaptive. The problem is that although it's perfectly normal, it can lead to some very undesirable consequences. One reason is that stereotypes, and I've been evolving over this period, I used to say they can be inaccurate, and now I'm more comfortable saying they have a tendency to be inaccurate. It used to be that psychologists would define stereotypes as inherently inaccurate, that they were overgeneralizations. Well, a stereotype is, as I stated before, a belief, and beliefs vary in their accuracy. But the likelihood that your estimate of the prevalence of some trait in some population is exactly right is very low. So even if you have sort of a directionally correct stereotype where you say, well, this group, men are more aggressive than women, that's a directionally correct stereotype based on a lot of data that we have available. But the likelihood that you could make a prediction about the differential likelihood that a man would aggress relative to a woman would aggress, that would be accurate, that's very low. So we may have some general idea about differential tendencies between groups, but it's really hard to make individual level predictions. And the other thing is that if it's a trait, if the stereotype is a trait that's not particularly prevalent, which is often the case, like criminality, making a prediction about it isn't going to be particularly useful. Making a prediction about somebody's behavior based on something that rarely occurs isn't particularly useful. We also know that stereotypes can be based on something we call illusory correlation. And it turns out that when we're presented with things that occur rarely but occur together, we grossly overestimate their relationship between them. And that's probably true. That's actually been shown to be true of minority status and crime as well. So people overestimate crime amongst minorities because they're rare events co-occurring, and they become more distinctive in our memories relative to other events. And we know that stereotypes are resistant to change. That also is normal and adaptive. If our beliefs and our stereotypes were constantly in flux and at the whim of new information, they wouldn't serve much of a function. There has to be some stability to them, and so we have these defense mechanisms for preserving our stereotypes, one of which is subtyping. When you encounter somebody who violates the stereotype of their group, you sort of find a nice little subcategory to put them in. President Obama is African American, but he went to Harvard. He's a different kind of black, right? I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but that's an example of how some people subtype. And even if stereotypes are quote unquote accurate, if they're pointing in the right direction, they will lead to discriminatory judgments about individuals. So you may be right that men are more aggressive than women, but if you treat all men as aggressive, you're going to discriminate against a lot of men. And you can see this sort of pattern of results where I really do have a left side bias. Maybe it's because I'm holding this in my right hand. So I'm always, hypothesizing. So you can have this effect where the stereotype that the police are operating on may be accurate, but the net effect, the aggregate effect, is to exaggerate the disparate outcomes because applying the stereotype about the group to the individuals and aggregating that up causes a distortion. I want to describe an experiment that I think is it's a simple and elegant and beautiful experiment that I think very well illustrates how stereotypes affect our judgments, because most people have sort of a intuitive sense that stereotypes affect our judgments in a fairly conscious way, but I think it's largely unconscious. And this example, which precedes much of the implicit social cognition research that I'm also going to describe, nevertheless, I think best illustrates how the process plays out. So this is a study by John Darley and Patrick Gross, and you may recognize the name Darley if you've done any psychology studies. He's most famous for his work on helping behavior and the conditions under which people will or will not help other people, and it's fascinating work. But in this study, he was interested in stereotyping and the effects of preconceptions about people on our judgments of them. And what they did was they had people see some information about a little girl named Hannah. I think they watched a little videotape of Hannah like leaving her home and walking to school. And in one condition of the experiment, Hannah was depicted as being somebody from a relatively low socioeconomic status background. And in the other roughly half of the sample saw Hannah depicted as someone who was relatively high in socioeconomic status. And when they asked people, how well do you think Hannah is going to perform on a school performance test or a school aptitude test, the people in those two groups rated her roughly the same on average. But when they watched a videotape of her, another set of subjects in the experiment watched her take a videotape of her taking an aptitude test where she actually had to answer questions and show what she knew or what she understood. The people who had been led to believe she was low SES rated her on average as below grade average grade level. And the people who thought she was high SES rated her performance as above grade level. They watched the same exact videotape. But now with that preconception about how low SES versus high SES people think and perform, and the ambiguous information about her test performance, watching her take the test gave them something to hang that stereotype on. And it wasn't, and I'm even describing it in a way that sounds too deliberate. With each of their, as they observed her taking that test, they had to interpret the ambiguities in her performance, her hesitations. When she got something wrong, was it because she didn't hear the question correctly or because she's just not that bright? And in this cumulative sense, the ones who had this preconception of her as low SES rated her as doing worse, actually doing worse on the test. So this is the fundamental nature of how stereotypes affect our behavior. We're presented with other people. They're not giving us all the information. We're just making judgments about what they're like based on some ambiguous information, and we are disambiguating. We are trying to make some kind of concrete assessment of that person in spite of the ambiguity and the incompleteness of the information we have about them. So I won't go into all the details, but social psychology, my field, has been studying stereotyping for nearly a century. And we know a lot about it, and I'll just to give you a sense of what we know about it, we know, for example, that we want to make a distinction between stereotyping and prejudice. Stereotyping being the more cognitive side, these specific beliefs about traits, and prejudice being the more emotional side, the positive or negative feelings that we have about people and the tendency that we have to like people more when they're from groups that we're from. We know that they serve this function of disambiguation, or this what we call a cognitive heuristic function. They give us a shortcut so that we can make a reasonably fast assessment of somebody else in the absence of complete information. The process by which they do that has a lot to do with it was best illustrated by the Darley and Gross experiment, this disambiguation process. We know that they're formed, they're learned like other beliefs, and they're relatively resistant to change. Studies have been done since the 1930s, just asking people what they think the traits of different groups are, and those have been generally becoming more positive, but it's still quite remarkable how people will say, yeah, those people are like this, and those people are like that, these people are cheap, and these people are law-abiding, and these people are stupid, and so people have stereotypes, and so many of them are willing to admit them. And then we know structurally that they're set up in these associative networks, these schemas, where you might have an image of a woman, a sort of archetypal woman in your memory, but there are all kinds of traits associated with that and specific individuals associated with that. And when you cause people to think about one of the nodes in that network, it activates thoughts of all the nodes in the network. And I'll provide an illustration of that shortly, but what we now know, really since the 1970s, is that like all cognition, perceiving objects, seeing triangles, stereotypes, so what we call social cognition, operates for the most part outside of conscious awareness and control. Most of the information processing we do toward inanimate objects and toward animals and people happens without our conscious awareness and control. And again, that's adaptive. It would be paralyzing if we had to consciously keep track. I mean, I'm looking at a whole room full of people here, and I'm storing information about most of you as you come into my field of vision. But if I had to really be thinking about that consciously, I would stop talking, which I'm sure some of you are hoping I will. So this is normal. It's normal, it's adaptive, it's efficient, but it has these undesirable effects because when we're disambiguating individuals from particular groups, our judgments of them are biased by those preconceptions. Okay, so another experimental design way to illustrate how this happens, and this is backing up, just talking about cognition more generally and not social cognition and stereotyping yet. One method that I think is particularly compelling that demonstrates to us that we do process information outside of conscious awareness and control is this word stem completion procedure that cognitive psychologists developed, where people are asked to just fill in a blank with the letter that first comes to mind. And you can imagine you know, a number of different vowels, A and O and et cetera, that you might want to use here to complete this to make it into a word. And what cognitive psychologists did in these experiments was, prior to asking people to do that, they would show them a subliminal presentation. We can talk later about the limits of subliminal influence, but in terms of processing people, yes, we do see and process the meaning of images and words that we don't have any conscious awareness of seeing. So if you show somebody this image for 10 milliseconds or 30 milliseconds with some noise, some visual noise around it, people will have no consciousness of having seen any particular image, let alone what it was, and they can't do better than chance at telling you if they saw this picture or another randomly paired picture. And nevertheless, the people who are subliminally exposed to this image are more likely to fill this word stem in with an O than people who didn't see this image or who saw this image, and these people would be more likely to fill it in with a U, and these people more likely to fill it in with an A. So these are just images I pulled off the web, but I don't think they were using these particular images. It also, turns out that you can subliminally expose people to names that are stereotypically associated with different racial groups, and they will respond differentially to ambiguous stimuli. So here's an ambiguous stimulus, here's a preconception, and we disambiguate based on something that we have no conscious awareness that we've been exposed to. Well, what if we see this image? And we could speculate that people who see this versus that are going to be more likely to fill it in with an I than with some other letter, because there's a stereotype of black men as aggressive and violent, certainly relative to white women. But we don't have to speculate. This experiment has essentially been done, and actually a more elegant experiment that's even more relevant to the issue of race and crime and policing. Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford University and her students, including Phil Goff, who I'm working with on this national police database that I'm happy to talk about later, they presented people with a series of ambiguous stimuli that became less and less ambiguous. So these are 3 out of a set of 40 slides of images like this, where people were asked as they appeared. So they would see first this, and it's interesting. So if you guys could forget that you saw that, what do you think you would think this image was? Florida. Yeah. Everybody says Florida. So, but having seen that, it's pretty hard to go back and not see the gun here. But in the experiment, not knowing that a gun is coming, the task people have is to say, as soon as they can, through the sequence as it becomes less ambiguous, whether it's a crime-related object or not. So there are some knives, and then there are some not crime-related objects, and people will indicate whether they're not. And what Eberhardt and colleagues did was to subliminally expose people to pictures like this, black men's faces, or white men's faces, or other neutral objects. And people were faster to identify crime-related objects when they'd been subliminally primed with black faces than with white faces or neutral objects. And I recently learned, I hadn't really noticed this before, but in this experiment, when they were primed with white faces, they were actually slower to identify the crime-related objects than in the neutral condition. So seeing a white face actually slows people down in identifying a crime-related object. But you can imagine how this is coming into play in what we're seeing in use of lethal force by police and the racial disparities that we're seeing. That when people are thinking about black people, they are spontaneously, even if they don't know they're thinking about black people, their thoughts about crime and crime-related objects like weapons become activated, and they're faster to see a gun. So, if I had several days to talk to you, I would describe all of the research on implicit social cognition, but I think the best way for you to do that is to just yourselves go to projectimplicit.org, where you can take an implicit association test, and actually you can choose among many implicit association tests. Some are on race, some are on gender and science and humanities, some are on ageism, but there are lots of different ones you can do. You can go and you can just do a demonstration, or you can actually volunteer to provide data, to give informed consent so that they can use your data. Millions of people have done this now, and we've learned a lot from it, but the bottom line is that indeed implicit biases like racial bias and particular stereotypes, but also just generally positive and negative implicit preferences for one group or another, are pervasive. And they correlate with explicit measures of bias, and they correlate with specific kinds of behaviors. So, for example, Ruth has shown that people with an implicit bias toward a particular minority group were less likely to call them in for a recruitment meeting after seeing their resumes. Rudman and Ashmore have shown that students who are biased against a minority group are less willing to allocate financial resources to that group and more likely to say nasty things about them. Green and colleagues have shown that actual medical residents doing a cardiac rotation, to the extent that their implicit bias against black people was stronger, they were more implicitly negative toward black people, they were less likely to prescribe a particular treatment, the appropriate treatment, for an African American patient presenting with cardiac symptoms. And Chris Finn and I have shown in the 2008 election data that people who had an implicit anti-black bias were more likely to vote for John McCain than Barack Obama, controlling for all of the usual suspects like party identification and explicit racial preference and policy preferences and things like that. Nock and colleagues have shown that people who implicitly associate themselves with death are more likely to attempt suicide subsequently. And I won't even go into the gory details of the Gray crime study because it's kind of gross. Another area of research that relates to this is what we call now research using the shooter task on the phenomenon of shooter bias. So now we're getting closer in the same vein of social psychologists using very cognitive psychological kinds of methodologies. We're getting closer to a direct application to the police, what we're seeing with disparate use of force against minorities. So in the shooter task developed by Josh Carell and his colleagues, they have people see a series of photographs one at a time, and it's one man in each photograph, and he's either holding a gun or a cell phone or some harmless object, and he's either black or white. And the task is just to shoot him as fast as you can if he's holding a gun, and to give the not shoot response as fast as you can if he's not holding a gun, with no instructions vis-a-vis the race of the individual. And the general finding is that people, white people in particular, but minorities as well, are more likely, are faster to shoot the black guys with guns than the white guys with guns, and more likely to make the error of shooting the unarmed blacks than shooting the unarmed whites. This shouldn't come as a surprise if you've seen the real world data, because that's what we're seeing, and I'm going to show you some more recent data on that as well. One of the important implications of this is that, as Eric Knowles and I found, is that this is largely driven by the extent to which they implicitly associate blacks with weapons. And it's not correlated, the shooter bias, the tendency to shoot armed blacks faster than armed whites is not correlated with an implicit racial preference, with liking or disliking for blacks and whites. It's more specific to the stereotype of the black weapon association. So we'd want to know, given the topic of the day, do police do this too? And we can do some syllogistic reasoning and say, well, there's no basis to assume that police officers' cognition is not normal. In fact, police officers, unlike most occupations, have to go through psychological screening, and so they're probably relatively normal. They're exposed to the same influences and maybe more influences that would cause them to associate race with crime. And so, we can conclude that police are prone to stereotyping and that these stereotypes, these pervasive stereotypes of race and crime are going to influence them. But we don't have to do that because it turns out that Eberhard and colleagues did this experiment with police officers too, and they showed the same pattern of results. They did a similar experiment where they subliminally exposed police officers to crime-related objects. In this experiment, they're subliminally exposed to racial faces of different race people. And in the other experiment, they're exposed to crime-related objects like weapons. And their task is to identify which side of the computer monitor a dot is. And it just so happens that on one side of the monitor, there's a black face, and on the other side, there's a white face. And when they've been primed, when they've been subliminally exposed to crime-related objects, they're faster at spotting the dot on the black face, which means that that's where their eye gaze is going. And so it's this bi-directional thing where thinking about black people causes police officers and others to think about crime, and thinking about crime causes people to think about or look for black people. And this is all even though these stimuli are being presented outside of conscious awareness. Similarly, Ashby Plant and Carell and their colleagues have shown that the shooter bias is also present in police samples, a number of different police samples that have done this task now. Again, this shouldn't be surprising. Police are normal humans with normal cognition. And it shouldn't surprise us if we look at what's happening in the real world. This is Christopher Ridley and Omar Edwards, who are two New York area police officers who were fatally shot while off duty by other police officers who were on duty. And these two events, these two particular shootings, raised enough concern that caused the governor of New York to commission, I think it was the governor or the attorney general or both, to commission a task force on police shootings. And they looked at a 30-year period, the previous 30 years, and they identified only 10 cases like this, where nationally, where off-duty, out-of-uniform officers were fatally shot by on-duty officers. In 2008, just before the report was issued, the Bureau of Justice Statistics estimated that about 75% of the U.S. police force, of the 600,000 or so police officers in the U.S., were white, and the other 25% were Latino, Black, and Asian, and other. So one might expect that if this is occurring randomly, that's 7 or 8 of those people shot would be white, but in fact, in the real world data, one of those officers, off-duty officers, was white, 8 were black, and 1 was Latino. And this is a pretty strong indication that there's a racial bias operating in the police behavior. Similarly, the Washington Post is now tracking officer-involved shootings that are fatal, so fatal police shootings. And they started this January 1st of this year. And if you look at these data, there's a lot to unpack in here, but I'm just going to cut to the chase, which is that among those who were fatally shot by the police who were in possession of a deadly weapon, the majority are white, or the plurality are white. But among those who are unarmed, they're more likely to be black or Hispanic. And they're actually more likely, there are more unarmed blacks shot than unarmed whites shot, even though whites are the majority population, they're more likely to be fatally shot by the police. Another way of looking at this is just among those who are fatally shot by the police, what proportion are unarmed, and it's more than twice as likely among blacks that unarmed people, that people who are fatally shot would be unarmed. So there's a real disproportion happening here. which shouldn't surprise us given that police show this pattern, are more like, faster to see weapons when they've been subliminally exposed to black faces. And we shouldn't be surprised about this pattern of results in the real world data when we consider just mathematically what will happen if police are targeting different groups, or this pattern of results. And I think I have some slides on policy implications that if people want to stick around we can talk about, but I'll just finish by saying that the collateral effects of this disproportionate policing are really severe and much worse than you might imagine. So, for example, obviously people who get a felony arrest lose income and wealth while they're in prison, and they have to spend more for their legal fees. The mark of a criminal record is a major decrement on future employment, and it turns out that it affects a criminal record affects blacks more than it affects whites in terms of finding subsequent employment. It's obviously destabilizing to families and communities to have large proportions of them out, especially wage earners, out of the population, out of circulation. They lose electoral representation. It's very hard to re-enfranchise voters after they've been disenfranchised for criminal conviction. And there's even research showing very dire community effects resulting from incarcerating people and returning to their communities, including HIV infection rates and the like. So I'm going to skip way ahead and end with a quote from the former commissioner of police in New York City, who ironically was responsible for ramping up stop and frisk, but said of racial profiling it's the wrong thing to do, and it's also ineffective.